The generative AI model does not understand the world. It just understands the information it's been fed.
Are these generative AI models going to hallucinate less?
There is no hallucinating less. It's a feature, not a bug.
How difficult it has been for them to align towards the truth?
Are you okay with trusting OpenAI to tell you what to think? Because that's what's happening.
If OpenAI or all these other firms get these answers wrong enough times, people will churn from one LLM to the next.
But the problem is, how would they know the answer is wrong? Hi, my name is Dr.Rumman Chowdhury, and I'm the United States Science Envoy for Artificial Intelligence, and you're listening to the Innovation Civilization podcast.
Artificial intelligence, ethics, and morality. Always an interesting topic, but also it's too intellectualized. I wanted to sit with an expert and have a conversation as a lay person to understand what it exactly is. Dr. Rumman Chowdhury is a distinguished data scientist and social scientist currently serving as the United States Special Envoy for AI. She is the CEO of Humane Intelligence, a nonprofit dedicated to building a community around AI model evaluations and responsible AI. Previously, Dr. Chowdhury led Twitter's machine learning, ethics, transparency, and accountability, the Meta team, focusing on identifying and mitigating algorithmic harms on the platform before Elon Musk took over. Prior to X or Twitter, she was the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture as well. So sit tight and enjoy the conversation. All right, Rumman Chowdhury, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. So, Rumman, let's get to it then. I have researched AI and AI ethics and so on and so forth, but just for the lay person out there, sitting in their home and listening to you who doesn't have a background about what this field exactly is, can you explain to us what you exactly do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a data scientist and a social scientist by background, and my work in responsible AI has always been about building solutions to make sure that artificial intelligence is beneficial for humanity. Now, sometimes we build technology and there are unexpected bad outcomes. Sometimes it could be that bad people are trying to do bad things with the technology, and teams like mine help stop those kinds of things from happening.
Oh, that's really interesting. And when you say bad things, often people talk about the telephone, basically, right? Where it's a technology and you can use it to plan a heist, or you can use it to basically trade and, put in a call, or even the ambulance, call the ambulance. So when you say stop people from doing bad things, like to what extent, what do you exactly mean in the context of AI, and how is that? What are the kind of things you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So especially with artificial intelligence, I think a lot of people think of it as being alive or making decisions on its own, and none of that's true. So I'm glad you referred to the telephone, right? All these things are tools. Artificial intelligence is a tool, and as a tool, it can be used for, good things and bad things. Usually the analogy people give in my field is talk about a hammer. You can use a hammer to break a window. You can use a hammer to build a chair. It can be destructive. It can be constructive. And what matters here is how a human being is using it. So when we say, stop bad things from happening, I think, there's a lot of Hollywood narrative in this. So they imagine there's this AI gone rogue and we're chasing after it. And it's actually usually about identifying people who are, in a sense, failure points. And there's two ways this can happen. So one is what we call malicious intent. So these are, hackers. These are mis and disinformation, bots or people who make these bots. These could just be people who want to, let's say, steal your data or information, or they want to harass people who may be using artificial intelligence to supercharge the bad things they're trying to do. On the other end, we get what we call unintended consequences. People who, with all good intention, made a technology, but there are unplanned externalities, unplanned bad things that happen as a result. And interestingly, in my field, the problems that are harder to tackle are the unintended consequences. Because if you think about it, you have to think about every single way a product could possibly fail, all the ways in which things could go wrong. And one of the big blockers to big corporations and AI being in everything, and it being something you interact with constantly, actually is that it's really hard to figure out and stop all the ways in which unintentional harm can happen from well-intending people.
That's really interesting, really, especially the unknowns kind of, I guess the second bucket, of what you're basically talking about. But, so Interestingly enough, like I know that when you say that AI can mean a lot of different things, right? And I guess, do you guys, I mean, currently the spotlight is on like LLMs, right? But obviously there's like, deep learning and machine learning and so on and so forth. So do you sort of work across those different things? And do you think like the harms are quite similar when it comes to all these different approaches to?
So that is another great point. And maybe to clarify for people listening to the podcast who may not know the difference between machine learning versus deep learning versus generative AI, because those words, there's a lot of loose language and all these 100%. Things get pushed into a bucket of AI. So the reason I mentioned that I'm a data scientist and social scientist, by background, I'm a statistician. And let's say machine learning models are very traditional, normal statistical models. They're just computerized and they work at scale. Machine learning models are very mathematical. These are mathematical functions that have existed for actually a very long time. And people like myself who know stats actually know how to interrogate and assess these models. When you get into this concept of deep learning and especially generative AI, things start to look a little bit different. So they are mathematical models, but they are different from the traditional statistical models that feed machine learning. So the thing is, when people say, AI is being used for everything, the reality is generative AI is actually not being used very much at all by companies because of its unpredictability. And most of the quote AI that you're seeing are actually machine learning predictive models because statistically they're easier to understand, they're easier to control. And when I say control, I mean like we can understand better like what's going to happen. So to your question about the problem space, I agree. Actually, the problem space, well, there's one new addition to the problem space when we think about generative AI, and that's hallucinations. Literally, they make things up, and that's not a bug. To use a programming phrase, it's not a bug, it's a feature. So generative AI means exactly that. It generates content versus, let's say, a statistical model, which is computing an output. Why is that important? Well, because a generative AI model does not understand the world. It just understands the information it's been fed. So it's going to synthesize or generate a response based on the information it has. And sometimes it completely makes something up because it's trying to probabilistically piece together words that are likely to go together. That's actually what a generative AI model is. It's a very sophisticated probability machine. With dumping lots and lots and lots of data, that probability is actually quite good. But to be clear, this AI model does not understand the context of what it's saying. It's just piecing together words that statistically go together. So if you think about generative AI model as being that, you can understand how it could piece together something that is actually completely fabricated. So other than, the harms that we have thought about for quite some time with machine learning and AI systems, like impact on society, bias, discrimination, now we have to think about things like hallucination and complete fabrication. So that's the only new thing I would add. What does change is how we have to address those harms.
Yeah, that's really interesting, really. And you are right. So currently working with a client in the operations space in aviation, right? And we've been trying to find a use case for generative AI, and LLMs. And it's basically so hard because of the lack of predictability that you're basically talking about. You are right. I think as a layperson, I've been using ChatGPT since it came out 2+ years now. And yeah, like it still hallucinates basically. And all these models, right? Whether, it's Google's Gemini and so on and so forth. And it's been surprising to a layperson that how difficult it has been for them to kind of align towards the truth, or insert like another layer of truth filter, basically. Yeah, it just seems like it's not there yet, basically. So is that going to get better over time? Like, are these models, generative AI models, are going to hallucinate less, or like, what's your take on this side?
There is no hallucinating less because, like I said, it's a feature, not a bug. Like by definition, that's what they'll do, right? So so one way that some people refer to LLM, sometimes it's like very sophisticated next word predictor, like very sophisticated, correct, right? So it's trying to impute what the next word is. So essentially, there is always some likelihood that it will completely fabricate a response. It will never be zero. I think there are methods that people are looking at to try to reduce that likelihood. But I think the reality is, because LLMs don't understand context, at least the current construct, it is impossible to say that we're just going to, quote, get rid of it. Because again, that assumes that it's a bug, not an inherent part of how the model works. Now, what's interesting is a lot of scientists are talking about reasoning models, which is a little bit different because a reasoning model actually builds on context. And that is a wholly different way of making these models. So it's not just like, just to get a little bit in the weeds, a retrieval augmentation generation RAG is a way that people have used to verify the sources, not necessarily fix hallucinations, but give you the resources to say, hey, is this true or not true? That's just something people added on to an LLM. So reasoning models would be a whole new type of model that would look different from the models we interact with today. And to your point about, that you said you're working with a firm that's trying to figure out how to use LLMs, the only use case I have seen from LLMs being used across many different organizations that I work with is they create a internal chatbot that helps you ask questions of a repository, right? So, let's say it's a whole bunch of HR documents, and they train a model, they fine-tune a model just on those HR documents, and anybody can go in and ask questions, and it'll retrieve the information based on that subset of documents. And that is quite literally the only application I have seen anybody do at scale.
Same here. Or like customer chatbots, basically, right?
I think chatbots are still, because, they are unpredictable. We've already had a couple
hallucinating as well.
Where chatbots are saying things that are completely false. I think the short version is the consumer liability is too high to create a customer facing product at this point. I think most people are exploring these things for internal use because, to be honest, they're more protected from liability. They're protected from, sort of losing face publicly or public embarrassment. And again, as I mentioned, I talked about like the problem space being near, and one of the biggest issues is sort of reputational risk right now, right? There's no actual liability if your AI does something wrong unless it does something that, is legally wrong, like denying somebody benefits or something, right? When they're owed it. But the reputational risk is for many companies too high. The other part I'll add is like, at no point have people ever actually wanted chatbots. If you remember the first chatbot craze of 2017, literally nobody wanted chatbots then either. So the fact that companies keep trying to make chatbots when nobody has ever asked for them is often quite baffling to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with a nuance, right? Because, so I don't know. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but since OpenAI's ChatGPT came out, especially with a live search option, I sort of switched to that versus using a Google search, like a lot of times I don't want 10 blue links. I just want the answer basically. Right. So my kind of
how do you know that answer is right? Like, are you okay with trusting OpenAI to tell you what to think? Because that's what's happening. Yeah. Because it's, when you are given the links from a Google search, it's your job to verify and synthesize. Correct. And it's an immense amount of trust in an organization to say, do my thinking for me. Because back to this, you don't know what you don't know. You have no idea what it's not surfaced. So it's surfacing something, right? Because this is the other thing that's actually an interesting artifact of a lot of this technology, both search engines and generative AI models. They have to write something. They don't not write things. So what they are writing could be A, complete garbage, or B, based on very scant or non-existing information. But you would not know that because it speaks as if it is very smart. And it will always say things in a very definitive fashion. What it will never tell you is, well, there's only actually 2 resources online and they're not quite reliable, but like, here's what they say. They'll just be like, oh, this is the answer. And that's my concern. It's, I think a lot of people talk a lot about like, oh, well, people critically think. That's not my concern as much as I don't want someone else to be in charge of telling me how I should think about things.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but on the flip side as well, I think it's a user experience thing. The more easier you make it for the user, like previously, for instance, like before technology, I literally had to go out, hunt an animal and come back home and like literally cook it myself and spend hours and hours and hours. Now it's just like Deliveroo, order, click right here, and I eat, right? the user experience is much faster. Now, I do think that there's something about, I do agree that, yeah, if you go for those 10 blue links, you can actually verify yourself, so on and so forth. But for a lot of people, I think they're okay with kind of delegating that level of thinking just for the right answer. And I think there might be even a product problem here where if OpenAI or all these other firms get these answers wrong enough times, people will churn from one LLM to the next.
But the problem is they won't know the answer is wrong. How would they know? How would they know the answer is wrong? If I've told ChatGPT to do the thinking for me because I don't want to do it myself, how would you know it's wrong? This is my point, right? Like if people want to be lazy, they can be lazy, but realize that you will be ignorant. That's the thing. Like you're totally correct. Like the thing is, the sad thing is people are incredibly lazy and they do not want to do the work. I fully agree with you on that. But then this is why we live in a world that is highly polarized because people get their snippets off of social media and they get outraged because they're being fed outrage by a machine. At what point do we look around and say, you know what? Maybe I should just think for myself. Maybe I shouldn't tell X or LinkedIn and Blue Sky and TikTok what I should be thinking and what I should be mad about. Maybe I should realize that these are all manipulation machines. They're not there to educate you. Neither is OpenAI. They are not there to educate you. They are not there to make you smarter. They are not there to make you better. They are there to make you reliant on their product. And that full stop is what it is. And the thing is, like, I think we've had many years, at this point, decades of essentially being manipulated by companies. And one of the things that I am increasingly glad to see is people are smart about it now. I don't know if I agree that people are totally fine with ChatGPT telling them the answer to things that matter. I think if it's like something, super dumb, they need to look up, like, how do I convert inches to centimeters or whatever? Sure. Like that's just like, that is what it is. But, things that matter to them should not be something you outsource to a company. And, I think so. I'll give you a counterexample. For the longest time in tech, people talked about the privacy paradox, right? And the privacy paradox was that people say they want their privacy to be preserved, but they don't want to go through the trouble of turning off all the things and then doing the stuff necessary to guard their privacy. But to your point, it's because the methods to protect yourself were made very high friction. Guess what happened when Apple introduced a very simple button you would press to say, ask app not to allow, right? Do not share my information. Overwhelmingly, people just used it, right? To the point that it has actually disrupted the ad targeting and data reselling industry, and companies like Meta were talking about how they need new revenue streams. So by making one button, Apple completely blew up this argument of the privacy paradox, which is the identical argument to the one you were making, right? Oh, companies make sign-up super frictionless. Everyone just gives their data. If you ask people to do this, they're not going to do it, blah, blah, blah. See, sorry, people say they want it, but they don't really want it because the numbers don't say that. And then somebody went and made it easy. And you could actually have your privacy preserved and it could be frictionless. So maybe the answer is, how do we make it easier for people to think for themselves? And search engines are actually great. I don't know. Like maybe I'm just a nerd. I really like reading. And I don't trust I'm old enough to know not to trust most institutions. So I take everything I read with a grain of salt, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah. No, I mean, you make some great points, basically. I think it was Perplexity who first came up with the kind of output where you would see the answer, but they would put those blue links embedded within the answer, right? As reference.
I really like Perplexity. That's the one I use, actually. So a few reasons I like Perplexity, and I am neither getting compensated from Perplexity
this
nor
is
do
not
I know
a paid
anything.
advert,
It's not an advertisement. But to your point, like they give me the links, right? Those citations and sources. And also they cross-reference across multiple platforms. And they also use search. So you can structure how you want it more academic, et cetera. So that to me is a wider breadth of sources. I can actually refine my sources by quality and I'm getting the output. What's interesting is actually the way I use Perplexity is the way I use Wikipedia, where I don't actually use the content. I use it to surface the links because it is, you're right. Like it is often a better search engine because it's actually going across multiple opportunities. So I think there are clever ways to do this where we're not sacrificing it's not even sacrificing. We're not, like, Sam Altman is not telling us what to think, right? That is the part that just really gets me. It's like these few men will tell the entire world what they should think about everything.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. And I do think there's a product there, and like you talked about perplexity, right? I mean, humans will always choose the path of least resistance. That's how our brains are wired, right? So yeah, I mean, I do agree that, even though you're sort of, compromising a little bit of what you're thinking, but there's always going to be people, who sort of prefer that. And let's move on to, I guess, talking about how do we stop some of these things from happening, right? So I know that human intelligence, you guys do a wide variety of stuff. Can you tell us, like on the top level, what are the kind of prevention mechanisms you guys suggest companies take to prevent some of these things happening? Yeah, what is on a high level and the important things to do?
Yeah, so just a bit about human intelligence. We're a tech nonprofit, and our mission is to build a community of practice around algorithmic assessments. And that looks like different things for different people. Traditionally, doing these evaluations of AI models required people like myself who had sort of programming ability, mathematical knowledge, etc. Our goal is to democratize that access. We started off by hosting these competitions called bias bounties, where we were actually teaching people how to, kind of like competition style, how to think about interrogating models for things like bias and discrimination. After ChatGPT came out, we actually conducted a massive, what's called a red teaming exercise. I'll explain what red teaming is in a minute. A red teaming exercise at this hacker conference called DEF CON, where we had 2,200 people give us feedback on how every major AI model, LLM, is performing. So we had 8 different models. So a couple of really interesting things. So one, red teaming is a practice that's actually very commonly used in cybersecurity. It's where in cybersecurity, it's where you bring in experts to try to hack your system, and it's used often external experts. So, and it comes from the military. It's like, can you get people to break into your base, right? In cybersecurity, it's, can you get people to, get past your firewall, or can you get people to give up their password, like phishing scams, right? And then in AI, it actually looks a little bit different. So now I can say, well, you are an expert on, let's say, like some language, right? Can you tell me if this model actually works accurately in this language? Or as somebody with a particular lived experience, can you tell me if this model is speaking accurately? Just as an example, we did a red teaming exercise with COVID and climate scientists, and we looked at how much mis and disinformation is possible using major large language models. So what's interesting here is the people doing the testing are not engineers. They are people with subject matter expertise. Now, I think part of the reason why people outsource their thinking to LLMs is we've been told this false story that AI is smarter than us, it's better than us, it has all the data, so who are you to defy it? Who are you to say you can even question it? And that is a very intentionally fabricated narrative. And what I love about doing these red teaming events is that people initially who are not familiar with AI models, right? We're working in this case with, let's say, scientists, we've done it with architects, we've done it with a wide range of people. We stick them in front of a computer and they're like, oh, I don't know how to do this stuff. And we're like, just, and we give them training. And then 15 minutes later, they're like super into it. They're like, I'm going to find all the problems. And like, that's the thing. I think that's the educational moment, because the one thing about human nature, I will say also, is that when you give people problems, they like to fix them. So the first stage is they're like, oh, I don't really do this AI stuff. Like, I don't really know AI. And we're like, don't worry, you don't need to know AI. Like, all right, cool. They're testing it. They're like, wait, that's wrong. And they're like, wait, no, that's not right. And then what happens is they all get together. They're like, how could we fix this? What do we need? And then the best ideas come out of that. So all the major LLM providers, all the major AI companies do engage in red teaming. I think the kind of red teaming we do, and we've actually partnered with a lot of AI companies because, as I mentioned, the risk space is near infinite, right? It's massive. So if you think about multicultural biases, if we think about language bias, if we think about minority communities, if you think about jobs and professions, I don't know, like, can you imagine being in one company and having to think of testing for every single possible iteration? I'll give you an example of one that, kind of came up early on that I was like, it's a little bit unfair that you are, dragging this company over the coals. So Stability, I think it was Stability. Somebody generated photos of like a woman in a kimono, and people were like, oh, well, the kimono is folded the wrong way. Like it's, you have to fold one side over the other, and the photos that were generated were the wrong way. And I'm like, is that the expectation? If so, that is quite a high bar that someone at Stability has to test by generating kimono photos of whether or not the kimono is being folded properly. And then as a South Asian, I'm like, so if I generate pictures of women in saris, am I going to be like, oh, you didn't fold it properly, and the balu's on the wrong side? But can you imagine the level of subject matter expertise in everything? So one of the things is that most of these companies are, in some sense, trying to reach out to communities to help them improve their models. And I think, for this technology to be beneficial to people, there are many things that need to happen, but one of them is literally the decolonization and de-Westernization, right? And the de-majorification of how these models operate.
That's really interesting, really. So when you do these red teaming exercises with these companies, the results of those red teaming exercises, fixes that need to be made, those are advisory and completely up to the discretion of those companies, right?
Yes, it is. And that remains a question that folks like myself are talking about and raising in different governments for regulatory bodies, policy groups, and things like that. So there is a whole movement on independent disclosure. And again, like what's interesting is some of the stuff does exist in cybersecurity. It's something that was independently argued for. But of course, cybersecurity has been around for a couple of decades at this point. And doing this work in AI is actually quite new. But yeah, absolutely. Right now, we do all of these things at the will of all the companies that allow us to, because what they could do is just shut down our access to their models.
What do you think about the prospect that, the biases that come in AI is basically like human biases, right? Because humans are quite biased. We are a product of our upbringing and, what our parents have taught us, society has taught us, and what kind of information feed we're subscribed to, what TikTok channels we follow, and so on and so forth, right? So is it, so AI is just like, in a way, a mirror reflection, basically, of the human biases, right? So do you think that it's ever possible to create this one or two or even three models which are completely unbiased and completely represents the kind of thinking of every person out there? Is that even possible? Or are we talking about a future where we have different models with different alignments and different biases, even something simple as religion can bring so many biases, to a certain kind of conversation, So yeah, I don't know how you think about, the future basically of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if we think about human beings, in order to make the kind of model that you're talking about, we would have to find consensus and agreement on just about everything. And we can't
exactly.
We're in a world in which we can't even seem to talk with our neighbors about anything.
Yeah, anymore, exactly.
Right? And also, you always have to ask, who would be making this decision? And I think even in order to attempt to arrive to this world, right, where we have models that are reduced bias, et cetera, you have to think through who is in that room deciding what is and isn't important to solve for. Right. And again, right now, it's very, very few people. It's literally, you can count them on one hand who's deciding what isn't important for this globally rolled out software that is purportedly smarter and better than all of us. So these are I just worry about the power dynamics in these situations. I think what I am aiming for, there's no such thing as a perfect model. And even the unbiased is a falsehood. There's no such thing as an unbiased anything, because it has to be, the thing is it has to be unbiased based on something, right? Some code of conduct, some ground truth, right? Anthropic calls it a constitution, right? You would have to have something that tells you what is right and what is wrong. It's your 10 commandments, right? Okay, murder is wrong, therefore clear, right? Don't do that thing. But even if you take something like that precept, which I think most people would say, absolutely, I think murder is wrong. The US is a country that has a death penalty, so we're killing people all the time, right? And that's legally condoned. It is fully allowed. It's not a crime to kill, for the state to kill people in the United States, right? So even something that we would say is very obvious, like you can't murder people, is not obvious when we get a little bit nuanced about it. So I think it would be near impossible / we would end up falling back on the very traditional majoritarian viewpoints to create a model that's quote unquote unbiased. The other problem is you never know the context in which someone's using a model. So I'm very sympathetic to Google when they ran into the issues with Gemini. So for people listening who may be unfamiliar, when Google launched a version of Gemini, they tried to make it more inclusive in the kind of photos and images that would come up. The problem is, you would type in, pictures of Nazis and it would make you black Nazis. And I'm like, I don't think anybody ever asked for a black Nazi, or like Pope, they would have like women popes. And people were really upset about it. But it's actually very interesting to me because it assumes a status quo ground truth. So it's assuming that whatever exists in the world today, in other words, we don't live in a world where female popes can happen, we don't live in a world in which a black pope has happened, that it's incorrect to be asking for that. It actually just depends, right? It depends. Maybe I'm writing a fictional story about a world in which there is a black woman pope and I just want a picture for the cover. You don't know. So the other thing is you will never know the context in which someone's interacting with the model. So that's what makes it really hard, because people don't always use AI tools to surface quote unquote factual information, right? Sometimes there's a societal reason to not want to enforce status quo. Sometimes there is just like, you're like, hey, I'm just a creative person and I'm actually writing a fictional story, or I'm doing something that I know is not true, and that's okay. So it becomes really hard to do that. What I think about instead is, what are the methods of contestability? What are the ways in which we have a feedback loop with these companies to say, hey, actually, this isn't working? And it's more than just like flagging a thing, right? And this is why we do these red teaming exercises. We draw so many interesting insights from these experts. So I'll kind of walk you through the event we did, as I mentioned, with COVID and climate scientists. So what they were able to do that, let's say, maybe a layperson couldn't, is they could actually see the content that the models were producing. And they're like, oh, I know what that is. That's actually lobbying material. That's material that like companies have written and different organizations have written to add. It's not factual. It's sort of massaging the facts to fit their, right? Especially in climate. We saw this a lot. The climate scientists were like, oh, that's wrong. Oh, that's wrong. But it sounded very factual. And again, you or I, we wouldn't know. We are not climate scientists, right? It's giving us what looks like reasonable information. It links to an article that looks very factual. But if you are a scientist, they're like, no, I know what that organization is. It's a lobbying org. It's paid for by big oil. This is their perspective. But that's what was surfaced and summarized by the model. So what they sat down, and again, like, so they first they're like worried about it. Then they find the problems. Then they go into problem solving mode. And then these scientists all started talking to each other. And they're like, the problem actually is that most scientific journals are behind paywalls. And the information that these AI models are trained on is just the information of the internet, which actually doesn't include the actual scientific studies many times, right? Because it's all, different paywalls for the different journals, which, I don't think I have heard people really think through like that. And then they started to say, well, what if we built a climate LLM that's trained on the good journal published scientific information and made that available if someone's trying to look for climate information? And this is where the problem solving is not just like tech people making new tech tools. It's people who are experts in the field who are not just able to pinpoint the problem, pinpoint the source, and think about a solution because it's in the context of what they know best, the world that they operate in. So what I want to build is methods of contestability and repair, right? That we're not just begging OpenAI to make fixes for us. We're not just like asking Sam Altman to prioritize what we think is important, but we're able to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. And I do think a feature where you've got many base models that you basically take and then you sort of jailbreak them and train them for your own purposes. Like if a community in Indonesia is trying to use AI for, I don't know, some of their own problems or, a product that they're building there. I mean, I have zero idea about Indonesia and its customs and values and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just taking that base model and then kind of working on top of that and having those feedback mechanisms that you talked about, right? To make it serve the community there, I wonder if that's the sort of way forward. And then you've got tons of other, communities and people doing the same with other models and so on and so forth, right? But not hyper reliant, I guess, on one or two of these models, to solve all their problems all around the world all the time, because they're just getting their biases into these and other communities and stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a conversation that's been going around the policy world for a bit. So last year, actually, I'm glad you raised Indonesia. Last year, as part of my envoy work, I did a sort of Southeast Asian trip. So I did Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, where I met with government officials. And it's actually really fun. It's a really fun role. I get to go to startup hubs and universities, and I get to meet with, heads of state and also a lot of them are cybersecurity people who are concerned about AI. And that's been a conversation that I see a lot where people are like, well, we should make our own homegrown LLMs. The problem is the sheer amount of resourcing you need from a data perspective, compute perspective, talent perspective, and just the money is so immense. It's so immense. It's nearly impossible. I don't know. So actually in a couple of weeks, Malaysia is going to be announcing that they're doing something called the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. They've opened an office for AI. And I think one of the things they're going to announce is they're going to make their own homegrown LLM. The thing is, sadly, OpenAI can outpace them in 3 weeks if they wanted to. That's the reality. Right? Because OpenAI can pay people $1 million salaries. And if they wanted to prioritize the Malaysian language in OpenAI, they would get it solved in 3 weeks, whereas, the Malaysian government would struggle to do it. And that is just the harsh reality. So I realize I'm holding two inconsistent thoughts. One is that all of the power should not be held by a few people, but also that it is incredibly difficult and it is a natural monopoly in this environment because of the sunk capital costs to even make and maintain these models, right? So the question is how do we solve for both of these problems? One way could be that, these AI models are a public utility. As lots of people have talked about, OpenAI started off as a nonprofit and has now shifted to a for-profit model. People trusted OpenAI because they were structured as a nonprofit. I'll point out, by the way, that Anthropic is a benefit corporation, a B Corp, which presumably says that it is for profit, but that it is supposed to be operating in the public benefit. And there's some sort of legal definitions of what it means to be a B Corp. I'll also point out that most B Corp, the spirit of B Corp was actually built more around sustainability and environmental impact. So one can have one's cake and eat it too, because you can be a B Corp and actually the requirements are quite minimal to demonstrate that you are, quote, benefiting society, right? Because it was not built around societal impact. But yeah, one answer could be these are public utilities. Another could be that, certain aspects of them are fully open. I mean, this is the model that Meta is pursuing with Llama, right? There are just these very specific problems to think through. But, then you have a country like Singapore, which actually did make their own large language model. So Singapore is coming out as this regional lead. They made this model called Sea Lion. Sea Lion actually works in multiple regional languages. So maybe the other answer could be there is some regional leader that at least represents the viewpoints, not of the specific country, but at least of the region. So Southeast Asia is a really good example of it because overwhelmingly the dominant and the most wealthy and powerful country in that area is Singapore. And Singapore does tend to lead that region. Of course, there can be a lot of politics around that, but I don't know, would it be better to have Singapore defining it than a company in Silicon Valley for whom your country and your practices and your language are kind of an afterthought?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I did not know about Sea Lion and also Kuala Lumpur Declaration. So that's quite interesting. So are you saying that it's harder for them because they don't have the same level of access to compute, talent, and
all
resources?
Of it. Okay. Actually, one of the biggest problems is actually data.
Data. Okay.
Yeah, literally, there is not enough digitized text in these languages or digitized text of these cultural practices.
Okay. Cool. That makes sense, really. So let's talk about, I guess, the elephant in the room, which is OpenAI, since we, kind of talked about it in a few times in different ways. But I think, like you said, they started off as a nonprofit and then moved on to a for-profit, just to, I guess, raise money and build compute and so on and so forth. Recently, I think they redefined or let go of their super alignment team. I don't know what exactly is happening, but I know a lot of co-founders like Ilya and others, left, right? And started something which, might be related to alignment more of AI. What's the situation? How do you interpret right now in terms of what level of checks and balances they have, on their models, and so on and so forth? Like, what's your interpretation on the ground right now of how they do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's all just self-enforced. They have checks and balances if they decide to have checks and balances. We don't really have meaningful regulation. Even if we did, the hardest part, actually the same issues we had with social media, right? What does it look like to punish a company? These companies are more wealthy and powerful than just about any given nation, sometimes multiple nations put together. What are you going to do? Fine them? They'll just hand over the money smiling, right? And this is the model we saw with Uber. It's come up in context of Meta, right? So fining them doesn't quite work. Maybe banning. I think we saw some countries attempt banning. That has a bit of a mixed bag. So I think the hardest thing to figure out is, what does punishment even look like for these companies? And then even before we try to figure that out, it's, what are even the agreed upon rules of the road? Like, what is wrong? What is not allowed? And who is tasked to even determine this? So another thing that Humane Intelligence and I advocate for is third-party assessments. Right now, we have governments and we have companies. So we have either one set of incredibly powerful and wealthy men who are in charge of everything, and another set of incredibly powerful and wealthy men in charge of everything. Sorry if that doesn't spark hope in me. But there is a lot of value to policy, but I don't want to make the mistake of just switching from one powerful manipulable entity to another powerful manipulable entity, especially especially in the US, how easy it is for companies to lobby. So the average company has more access to a senator than the average citizen does. They hire teams and teams of people to sit in DC, and all they do with their very well-paid jobs is knock on senators' doors and congressmen's doors and say, hey, this is how you should think about this. And, it's lobbying. It's perfectly legal in the US. Instead, think about third parties.
Yeah. So from your perspective, then a third party should be more like the users of that tool who come in and help with red teaming. Is that like
it could be, or it could be organizations that are, not like, we have NGOs, we have organizations getting, better and better at analyzing and assessing tech. We have people like myself who assessed and audited algorithms. I think it's actually literally an industry of practice, and there's precedent for it. For example, in the financial industry, you have to hire independent auditors, or you have to hire independent people to look at your books. So it's not the government who looks at your books. It's not your company that says, I looked at my books and I'm doing okay. You actually have to hire an independent person to assess them, right? It exists actually in education and other fields as well, assessing quality of education, quality of outcomes. It's an entire industry. So what's fascinating is people talk a lot about AI and impact on jobs, and there's not a lot of talk about like what kinds of jobs could be created with AI. And I see algorithmic assessment, auditing. This should be a profession that people independently have. And I think I would love for that profession to exist, right? So I wouldn't have to work at a company in order to get access to models, in order to understand how they're working, in order to advise companies on how to fix them.
Yeah. That's quite interesting. I wonder if there's, how states have the jury system basically in courts. If a similar model can be done for like AI models, where you select people, random citizens across the country to be jurors, basically, to conduct red teaming exercises of the biggest models,
So what's amazing is that exists. So last year, Humane Intelligence worked with the United States National Institutes for Standards and Technology. And my friend Riva Schwartz has spearheaded and led this program called ARIA, Assessing Risks and Impacts of AI. And it's literally exactly that. So we recruited any legal resident in the United States to red team AI models. And the whole goal of it was to understand how regular people interact with these models. So to your point, like that's literally a paradigm that we're trying to push. And then, there's like legal issues around it where, for example, the government can't and shouldn't be like going around recruiting people. That's why we exist, right? We actually go do that for different organizations. And that's like increasingly something that people are asking for. I'm actually really heartened to see that. And to your point, like so like what you're talking about, like what we call public red teaming versus expert red teaming. Expert red teaming would be like, I'm getting scientists to evaluate this model. Public red teaming is like anybody can sign up. We want your opinion on, and like maybe you have something new and interesting to say. And the way they structured it is kind of fascinating. They created what's called a proxy scenario. So instead of, exposing people to harmful information, they created a scenario that would mimic that structure. So rather than say like, try to steal a password, what we had was try to get the AI model to tell you the spoiler of a movie. And then we trained the model to not give. So if they were able to bypass and get the spoiler, then we understood that like actually you could hack that model, right? So just as an example, we did one on hallucinations where the task was, get the model to give you incorrect like travel information. So you had to interact with the model and basically try to ask it to give you directions or give you flight information or whatever it is and try to break it. And we had so many people across US sign up. It was actually a competition, and the top 30 people, we flew them to DC to work with NIST, as I mentioned, CISA, which is a cybersecurity, the US cybersecurity agency, to then actually go in and physically red team models with 4 different companies that we worked with. It was just an absolute pleasure to work with them. One thing that was very fascinating is we didn't even do this on purpose, but we ended up with a very diverse group of people in every definition of the term diverse. We had literally equal men and women. Again, we did not recruit for this. This was just purely points-based, pure meritocracy. We had, I think, equal men and women. We had a wide range of race, wide range of background and skill. Some people were like cybersecurity people. Other people were like academics and researchers. Other people were just hobbyists. And what was amazing is when we put a call out all across America, there we got actually a representative sample of what Americans look like. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I want to get your take on a certain aspect. So we talked about, I guess, these jury models, auditing, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the kind of company builders, especially in the AI space, might talk about it, say, Rumman, like, all that sounds great, but we're sort of worried about these audits and regulations coming in too early and stifling innovation, So what's your sort of take on striking the right balance between like stifling innovation versus, getting things right, And a lot of people point to Europe, for instance, and you can give your take on what you think on European regulations, so on and so forth, as being choke point basically for a lot of kind of tech companies here in Europe in general, not just AI, but in general, because of the large amount of regulation and so forth. So yeah, so what's your take on how to kind of balance that innovation stifling versus, getting things right?
Yeah, so I actually testified to the House Science-Based Technology Committee literally about this. And, my take is actually the same that it's been for quite some time. The phrase I use is brakes help you drive faster. So you think about if you're driving your car on the freeway, you might go over the speed limit. You might go, 70, 75 in the US. And the reason you do that is if like if somebody cuts you off, if a deer runs into the road, if there's an obstacle, you can slam on your brakes and stop, right? If you didn't have brakes to help you stop, everybody would be crawling on the road at 5 miles an hour because we'd all be deathly afraid of, injuring ourselves. And that's actually the purpose that good regulation is supposed to serve. It's supposed to give you brakes. And to extend the analogy, it actually helps you innovate faster. So one thing I found during my time at Accenture as responsible AI lead, a lot of the companies we worked with, the number one question they ask is like, okay, what are the appropriate parameters for using AI? Like what's legal? What's not? What can I do? And as long as the answer remains, we don't know, they're not innovating because they're not like, it's the conversation we had at the beginning of this call, right? They can't figure out how to solve these problems. They're really worried about the unknown liability, the reputational risk, etc. They feel like, they're just going to be out there on a limb. So everyone's like, you know what? I'm just not going to do it, right? The big reason we haven't seen a deluge of consumer-facing generative AI products is nobody knows what's allowed and what's not allowed. So you're putting yourself into the court of public opinion if you do that. And that's not a risk most companies are willing to take. So in this field, completely unfettered, quote unquote, innovation defined as a lack of regulation is actually, that is what's stifling innovation. I think most companies, most startups, for example, would love to know this is allowed, this is not allowed, this is how you can get approvals, whatever. And they'll just go and they'll do it because they just want to put their product out there.
Is that true, though, that you're not seeing a lot of generative AI products? I mean, like, the open source space is quite innovative, right? People are taking those llama models and, there's a bunch of stuff happening in AI and crypto right now, right? And largely because people are finding that I guess it's different for incumbent companies, obviously, because, they've got a lot of reputation to keep and so on and so forth. But for certainly like a startup, which is like nothing, you just build shit, right? And see how it goes.
But then it comes to bite you in the ass, right? Yeah. The thing is, actually, the startups in the AI space that are doing the best overwhelmingly right now are actually security startups, right? Because that's where you can get people who have native knowledge of AI models using what they do at scale, right? Because these startups have to sell things to somebody. They can't just, live on vibes and VC funding alone, not forever. And we have not yet seen any sort of a generative AI product come out of anything, whether a startup or a big company, that's really been this like consumer market, like everyone on earth knows what it is. Like everybody plays around with ChatGPT, right? Like, I think they love to quote, like cite all these, like whatever, 90% of all Americans up, like, cool. But what are you using it for anything? Or did you just like go on it for 5 minutes because you heard about it on the news and then you called it a day, right? Like it's, if we think about our lives, our day-to-day lives, it's been a very long time since a technology has come in and actually changed our day-to-day. Not like, oh, it's a topic of discussion, not like it's an intellectual, interesting thing, but like truly changed what we do. And I'm laughing because the last thing I can think about is like my mopping vacuuming robot, which is a robot, which is, that's the thing. I think we're over intellectualizing, but if we truly want to create, and Apple is like very good at this, right? Creating products that are like actually integrable and useful in your lives. There isn't an AI product that it is willingly in everybody's home that people are paying for and using and utilizing and getting benefit from. And if you like can rewind time, I feel like the 2000s were like this magical decade where like we just kept getting things that just changed our lives. We're like, oh my God, an iPhone. Oh my God, AirPods. Like, oh my God, whatever it was. We just kept getting all this tech that like revolutionized how we communicated, right? How we met friends, how we got directions, like anything. And now we're just like, we've hyper intellectualized this quote AI thing. And I think people have sort of talked themselves into a corner and maybe it's like not cool or not interesting to just solve basic problems like mopping your floor. But that is going to be more revolutionary than making the best hyper tuned AI model for the average person, right? Because I'm talking about the average person here.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, really. So how does this practically look like? So what will be your ideal world? Say a company is starting and they're trying to build LLM models, let's just say. At what point should they put up their model for an audit to a third party and stuff? Is it like pre-product or like before launching into the market or after getting a few thousand users? I don't know, like what's your take on that tactically?
Yeah, I mean, and this has actually been true for a while. One of the biggest differentiators for startups is demonstrating that you are safe and responsible and ethical. And that's actually why a lot of startups, not that they look for regulation, but they look for things like certification. They look for ways to like differentiate themselves. And one point differentiation would be to say, hey, we care about you, customer, like because we're a small company and showing care can mean many different things. I'll give you actually a really good example. I had mentioned that we did this like in-person red teaming exercise with all the people who won the competition. One of the companies that we worked with is called Synthesia. Synthesia is an enterprise company that creates like anybody can make a video on their platform, right? And it's a video generation, but they're trying to market this tool for like, companies can make internal training videos, HR videos, whatever. You can actually make, a video of you and then give it scripts and it'll, generate whatever. What was really fascinating is although image models and video generation models are some of the easiest to hack and to make them do malicious things, theirs was the hardest to crack. And it's because they spent a lot of time and effort creating their content moderation and assessment tools on top of the product themselves. Like, why would they do that, right? Why as a startup would you spend so much money building like all of these essentially blockers for people to just make whatever video they want. It's because they're smart. They're thinking about the long game, right? They're thinking about, well, people won't trust this tool, and if they don't trust this tool, they're not going to pay us money to use it. So, to your question of like, when should companies start thinking about this? I also appreciate, as a former startup founder myself, that you don't have a lot of money, right? So you're not sitting there and you're like, right. Oh, I can hire this person to do all of this work for me, because that's like one of your 3 staff that you have, right? There's this really great group called Startups in Society. They're actually now a subsidiary of the I think, the Responsible AI Fund. And that was specifically what they were working on. They were working on like, what does it look like for a startup to think about what it means to build responsibly, appreciating things like, how do you find VCs that will support you? How do you do this in a way that's, not going to be completely like ruin the bottom line for you? And they had some really good thoughts. Things like, there are specific aspects of like product design, product management, where you can build in these checks. There are ways to like lightweight do your own auditing and assessment. There are ways to align with civil society organizations, for example, like mine, that are actually willing to do this stuff with you and essentially make you look good. I mean, these companies that we worked with, 3 out of 4 of them were startups. One is Robust Intelligence, which has been acquired by Cisco. Another was Synthesia, and another was this company called Anote, and the other one was Meta, and they contributed a Llama model. And it was really great, and we're really grateful for this, is they put themselves out there, right? They were willing to be tested, and they had no control over what these people were going to do. And, overwhelmingly, it leads to goodwill. So my input for startups would be like, don't be worried. It's better if you step into this world now rather than step into it later when you are now defined as the bad guy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, really. And I mean, it is true that if you're trying to design a product that's going to be loved by millions of people, you should take these things into account, right? And I guess, but that also goes on to the fact that this essentially becomes like self-regulation if there's no external regulation there per se. What I'm keen to understand from you, by the way, is like, for instance, like a lot of the security stuff out there, like we've got these certifications like SOC 2, certifications for trying to sell B2B SaaS. There's like others, there's GDPR, for instance, in Europe. So like, is there any equivalent established certification in AI? Like if you try to implement AI out there, is there anything?
There isn't. And that's there's so, like, I have so many feelings about this.
Yeah.
I'll speak as the data scientist part of me, and then I'll speak as the AI governance part of me. Right. So the AI governance part of me would say that there's a lot of organizations trying to make certifications. So IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which pretty much made most of the privacy certifications that a lot of lawyers get today to do like privacy tech stuff. They've started one. There's a bunch of different organizations that have created algorithmic auditing training. One can get certification. The problem is that there is no like organization that holds like institutional credibility and clout, right? So it's sort of like, I say I'm a data scientist, like I came into data science in like 2012, right? Back when it was just a fully undefined field. And it was kind of similar. Like everyone was like setting the curriculum, we had Coursera, so when Andrew Ng became Andrew Ng, right? And it was really hard. And over time, we sort of settled on like, oh, this is what it means to be a data scientist, the kind of stuff you have to know and learn, and we're able to assess. So I think there's and now I'm going to talk as a data scientist part of me, right? It's not even a problem. I think it's a beautiful thing about tech. The beautiful thing about tech is like, we don't listen to people. I think lawyers, and there's a lot of industries like law, medicine, et cetera, where you are indoctrinated into an institution, right? You are told you have to get the certification, you have to do your residency, you got to pass the bar, you got to do this. Yeah. So we have none of that in tech. And in some ways it is very beautiful. It is very beautiful because we don't have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to some institution to tell us we're smart, right? We have to go and actually prove ourselves. I kind of love it, right?
Yeah. And I don't
want to kill that.
Egalitarian in many ways, yeah.
Yeah, like in some ways it is. And I kind of I don't want to kill that. I don't want this to be, oh, if you've, got this fancy degree because you could afford to go to Stanford, clearly you're smarter than everybody else, right? Like this is the industry that basically said no to that. And I love it for that. That's one of my favorite parts of tech. But then on the other end, you're right. Like, so if none of these organizations have credibility, then who does? Then who is the person tasked, the organization tasked? I think, like with most things, I think solutions come from the bottom up. I think if, as I was talking about earlier, if we have a profession that is born out of regulatory necessity to audit algorithms, what's going to happen is we are going to actually arrive on what the hell it means to audit an algorithm, which we don't even know, by the way. Like, I say things like I audit algorithms. I will tell you, like, somebody else may audit an algorithm totally differently because we don't have a standard. We do it the way we think it should be done, right? And people hire us because we're quote unquote experts, which is, absent certification, that's the best you can do. So maybe the answer is, like, if we do have regulations that kind of mandate this, and we have maybe a grace period, right? And sometimes there's what's called regulatory sandboxes, which looks, if you're a tech person, you know what a sandbox is, right? It's a test environment. What if we created a regulatory sandbox, which has, by the way, happened before? So in the UK, FINRA, which is their financial services regulatory body, they do this. They've created regulatory sandboxes where companies will sign up to help them test out regulation. And the whole point is, like, you're not going to be penalized if you break it. And you're helping them understand whether or not the regulation works. Like, it would be really cool to do something like that and help this industry build and grow and flourish.
Yeah. And I think one thing you've talked about is building more AI safety institutes around the world. Do you still stand by that? And what do you think the job of these AI safety institutes would be like on a practical basis day to day?
Yeah, AI safety institutes still remain government entities. I think they serve, like, what we've seen now, even since I wrote that op-ed, in September. Well, what we saw in September was that global majority countries didn't really have safety institutes. Now we do have more. There's actually one that's popped up in Kenya. A lot of the Asian countries have them. So the Japan, not that it's a global majority country, but Japan AI Safety Institute is like one of the best. Korea is one of the best as well. I work with the Singaporeans who are part of their safety institute. So I do think it's a practice that's going to grow. These entities are still government entities. So I think it serves a purpose. I think it's important to have this bridge between existing government infrastructure and tech. I don't think it's the same as having fully independent third parties, right? Because being a government entity just means that, even if you're marketing yourself as not, you are. So that would be like, I think they all need to exist is my answer. You need an ecosystem, right? You need regular people to be able to give feedback. You need third-party organizations that are independent actors that have access to assess these algorithms. You need safety institutes, which is specialized bodies within government who deeply understand and can assess how these models are working through a national security or in the societal impact lens as it relates to government mandates. And then you also need companies, like, internally doing this work and staffing teams. Like, none of this absolves companies from the need to fund and have this work internally as well.
Yeah. As you're sort of explaining the whole ecosystem, it is true that it is getting a bit murky, like if you're like a founder who's just trying to, build AI and ship products, or like a company is trying to do stuff, like what's the one thing I just need to do, just give me the answer, right?
Well, isn't that the thing? Isn't that the thing?
Yeah.
It's like, people will spend so much time, money, and energy on thinking through like nuanced aspects of their product. But when it comes to like safety, they're just like, what's the one thing? And I'm like, well, there isn't I guess if I were to give one thing, right? Like, and maybe this doesn't even have to do with safety. It just has to do with like making things that are useful for people, which I would say, if like there's one reason I'm here, it's just to try to make things that are useful for people. Like, actually figure out and make sure your product is useful for people, and not like you think it's useful for people, or you and your friends want it, or it's what VCs are willing to fund. Like, truly understand what you're building and who you're building it for, and whether or not it's something that is actually solving the problem for them. And maybe that's like very basic, but I think a lot of these problems, especially of unintended consequences, could have been resolved if someone sat there and thought, is that actually the problem?
Yeah, 100%. I want to take your opinion on what you think is happening with social media right now. I know Zuck came out and talked about following some similar model to community notes on X versus having their own content moderators and so on and so forth. Obviously, understanding what is the truth is a huge challenge in the world of AI, as well as just like, internet, I guess. What's your take on where X and Meta is going towards? And any thoughts there, basically?
Yeah, X is already there. Like, it's not going anywhere good, is the short answer.
I believe you were working at X before, right?
Well, I worked at Twitter, not X.
Okay. Before it was changed. Okay.
I worked at a totally different company. Correct.
I see.
So I was there. My team, I was the engineering director of the machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability team. My team was part of the first wave of firings. I mean, come on, of course, right? I don't think Elon Musk's idea of ethical use and my idea of ethical use align in really any way. But yeah.
Does he have an idea of ethical use?
I think he thinks he does.
I see. Yeah.
But I don't. I don't know if we've seen it quite manifest, right? And in terms of, Meta, I am so sympathetic and actually empathetic to a lot of my friends in Meta right now. Getting rid of content moderation is one of the worst things you could possibly do, right? Content moderation, well, first of all, content moderation requires very specific expertise. There's also I think also people don't realize how many AI and machine learning models are actually used in content moderation as well. So there's the human aspect and there's also a computational aspect. So I don't know when he says he's getting rid of moderators, if he also means he's getting rid of the engineering teams that make moderation tools. I don't know if I know what, how that's being defined, because that would be a problem that even that community nodes could definitely not cancel. The other part is if that becomes the sole source of truth, right, for the platform, it is very obvious and evident to anybody like myself who's ever worked on social media platforms and preventing harm that it is absolutely ripe for mass manipulation. So if there is no other moderation tool other than this sort of public poll, what you do then, if you are a misinformation entity, is just fund a lot of bots to post to it to sway. Yeah. And this is not
it's possible gaming.
It's not even bots. It's also people. I'll give you a funny example. K-pop, as you know, is huge, and people have very strong feelings about K-pop. Very often things would pop up that looked like manipulation, that looked like bots. And actually it was just swarms of K-pop fans who would all coordinate, like a coordinated campaign to push for what they want. I mean, Taylor Swift fans are actually very similar, right? So Swifties and K-pop fans, never underestimate. Yeah, it's never underestimate the power of a tween with a poster on her wall. They will coordinate. Coordinated action is real. But it's fascinating, right? So, and that's a silly example, but we've seen it actually happen in the United States. So I used to teach data science. One of the students I had did a project on identifying bot manipulation in public opinion. So in the United States, when there is something that's going to be discussed, let's say, in this case, it was actually the net neutrality bill. So this was obviously some years ago. They open for public commentary and anybody can write and then they can say I'm for it, I'm against it, whatever it is, right? And to an extent, it helps motivate how politicians are thinking about it. At that time, it seemed that actually most Americans were against. They wanted, no controls over, what's on the internet, et cetera. The analysis that my student did demonstrated that a lot of them were bots. So people were making bots to make it look like a lot of people had a particular perspective on net neutrality. That wasn't necessarily true. So we know that's what happens. So my concern about opening things up, and again, I don't know what the exact plan is, right? What do they mean by getting rid of content moderators? If it's only going to be community notes, well, you're just opening yourself up for mass manipulation, coordinated manipulation campaigns. And the thing is, anyone who's worked at a social media company, that. Because that's what happens. Every election, every time, that is just par for the course.
Yeah. 100%. Brilliant. There's two more questions I have, and then I'll let you go, I promise. One is, and this is, if I don't ask this, obviously the audience are going to be super mad at me, but you are the US Special Envoy on AI. And right now, as we speak, we've got a new president who'll be taking oath. What changes do you expect US to hold in terms of AI policy and regulation in the next few years, basically? Is there anything that's going to be different, or what's your take on how things are?
Yeah, I mean, Trump had a very explicit platform that he ran on as it related to AI. And the first one was that he was going to roll back everything in Biden's executive order. So last fall, President Biden wrote a presidential executive order mandating actually a long list of things related to AI regulation, including the institution of chief AI officers, increased testing and evaluation. Actually, I lived in DC for a year because I was working with some of these agencies. This is where the NIST work came from. Working with some of these agencies to do work like this. So, I mean, Trump has pretty much said what he's going to do, right? He's going to roll back all of these protections, a lot of the, basically anything that was in the executive order. But I think also just it kind of remains to be seen. One of the most interesting things is that there is a lot of public scrutiny on AI companies on both sides of the aisle, right? Both Democrat and Republicans, barring the president himself, like, the average Republican senator or representative is thinking about what does it mean to regulate an AI company, right? What does it like, how they may be prioritizing different problems. They may be thinking about it differently than Democrats, but they're certainly thinking about it. So one thing that is a common thread through both parties, independent of who the president is that most constituencies and therefore most Congress people kind of want to know, how do we go about regulating these companies? So I'm really curious to see what happens in the US, because just as a nation, we are all smarter about artificial intelligence. I will say in the past, like, I know it's sort of a meme to make fun of Congress, but actually the Congress people that I've worked with are really sophisticated and knowledgeable about tech.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah, well, there was actually a 250-page bipartisan report that came out through through the House of Representatives. It came out probably about like 2 weeks ago. It's quite good. It comes from a lot of the testimony that folks like myself have given. I mean, it's 250 pages long. They've done their research, but it's worth looking at. It's worth thinking about. I guess I'd add, like, the theatrics you see on C-SPAN is not always what happens behind closed doors, because that's what that is. Like, that's often like theater. And they're up there and they're there to like make a point. They're not necessarily there for reasons other than that. What's more interesting is like digging into, and this is like kind of like the unsexy, unfun stuff, is like digging into the reports they come out with, digging into what are the bills that are put on the floor, right? What are the perspectives that they have? And it's interesting. So I'm curious to see where it goes.
Do you think the actual senators are drafting these thoughtfully, or is just their staffers who are just, putting meat in the bones? And yeah.
I mean, yeah, the secret is it's always the staffers, but it's always been the staffers, right? It's never not been the staffers. But, like I said, like, I've had some incredibly thoughtful, well-reasoned and intelligent conversation on both sides. Actually, one of the most well-informed Republicans on this is Obermeyer, who's one of the co-authors of this bipartisan bill. And interestingly, his career started as a game developer. And he got into Congress later. So, and again, maybe he's more of an exception than a rule, but, and on the other end, you have people like AOC who have very intelligent, thoughtful things to say about technology and its impact on people. So we'll see how where the next 4 years take us.
Yeah. All right. Looking forward. So we talked about the US, and I guess we'll wrap it up. I just want to get your thoughts on you've traveled, like you said before we started the conversation, that quite a few countries, your work has taken you. Which country would you point to as kind of, in your opinion, is a great example of where the AI ecosystem, like the third parties and the NGOs and the governments are working quite decently and towards the right kind of vision, which you think is the right one? Is there like a government or a country or an ecosystem that you think, is really commendable?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one. I think one of the most interesting things about my travels, and, I've been doing this for some years now, is that different parts of the world are really good at some things versus other things, right? The things that the US is very good at, for example, is entrepreneurship. And when I say entrepreneurship really broadly, because I run a nonprofit now, but it is literally no different from being a startup founder, right? So we have people, for example, in the UK or in Asia will say, US has a really robust civil society. Like, you actually have these NGOs and you have like 501(c)(3)s, you have groups like the ACLU or whatever, right? That do this work. And like, our countries don't have that kind of thing. Like, literally, legally, structurally, they don't have those kinds of things. In other places, you would look at Europe and you'd say like, wow, they're actually really good at consumer protection. Like, they have all sorts of people who are very entrenched, who like think a lot about how to protect consumers, and, they're passing laws maybe more like mindfully than the US. Then you could look at Asia and you could say, wow, Singapore is this like amazing leader in building technology really well, but embracing responsible use. So like, the responsible tech industry in a lot of Asian countries is actually really good. Like, there are startups that are doing quite well and, doing this. So I feel like it's sort of like different, ideally you could like pick and choose some different things. And, like, people are doing.
Yeah. Okay. That's really great to hear. But I guess it's great to hear that different people are leading in certain fronts, and like there's always stuff to learn, I guess, from each ecosystem and each group of people, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, with that note, just want to thank Rumman for your time. It's been an amazing conversation, and all the best with Humane, and all the best with your work with the new kind of political waves which are upon us.
All right.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.